It started like any other flight, the hum of engines warming beneath the cabin floor, the sterile chill of air conditioning, the steady flow of passengers shuffling toward their seats. But no one on Flight 237 could have imagined what was about to unfold. Not the tired business travelers scrolling through emails, not the young mother with a crying baby, and especially not Jalen Carter, a quiet 17-year-old whose life was about to collide with a kind of power he never knew he had. No one knew that this ordinary flight would turn into a story millions would talk about. The faint rumble of engines pulsed beneath the metal floor of the jet bridge, like a heartbeat waiting to take flight. The air smelled of jet fuel, disinfectant, and burnt espresso, the signature scent of airports around the world. Outside the glass, Jalen caught a glimpse of the aircraft's sleek white fuselage glistening under the morning sun. For most travelers, it was just another plane. For him, it was a symbol of something bigger, something beyond the cracked sidewalks and narrow streets of the Atlanta neighborhood he called home. Jalen had always loved planes. As a kid, he'd lie on the hood of his mom's old sedan and stare at contrails slicing the sky. Each streak felt like a promise that one day he'd go somewhere beyond what he knew. And now, here he was, 17 years old, boarding his first solo international flight. His mother, a nurse working overseas, had saved every extra dollar, skipped lunches, picked up late shifts just to make this trip possible. He thought of the way she'd hug him that morning at the curbside drop-off, whispering, "Be brave, baby. You belong in the sky, too." He clutched the strap of his backpack tighter, a clean white hoodie, headphones around his neck, a quiet smile that masked the nervous drum in his chest. The boarding line moved at the slow, impatient rhythm only airports know. Someone sighed loudly behind him, rolling their suitcase an inch closer. Another passenger brushed past, muttering about their connecting flight. A toddler wailed 3 rows back. The flight crew's voices echoed faintly from the cabin, crisp and practiced. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." Step by step, the light of the terminal gave way to the narrow tunnel of the jetway, and then the soft whoosh of the cabin door, sealing the world outside. The moment Jalen stepped into the plane, a rush of cold, recycled air brushed against his face. The overhead lights reflected off gleaming luggage bins and polished flooring. Rows of seats stretched before him like a maze of blue fabric and silver buckles. Flight attendants stood at the entrance like gatekeepers, offering their routine greetings. One smiled warmly. Another gave a polite nod. But then he saw her. She stood slightly apart from the others, posture straight, chin high, like someone who measured people the second they crossed her path. She was tall, sharp-featured, with piercing blue eyes that didn't quite match the forced smile on her lips. The gold wings on her uniform gleamed under the cabin light. Her name tag read, Monica, but it wasn't her uniform or her name that made Jalen's stomach tighten. It was the way she looked at him, not with the soft welcome she gave others, but with a slight narrowing of the eyes, like she was already waiting for him to mess something up. Her gaze lingered a second too long, and in that second, something shifted in the air. Jalen straightened his shoulders, pretending not to notice, but his heart ticked faster. She tilted her head, almost imperceptibly, and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. He moved down the aisle, surrounded by the symphony of travel, the rustling of boarding passes, the beeping of seatbelt signs, the hum of a jet engine waking up. He was just another passenger, just another teenager trying to fit in somewhere he'd never been. But Monica's eyes followed him for 1, 2, 3 steps. And though Jalen didn't know it yet, in less than an hour, their paths would collide in a way that no one on this flight would ever forget. The aisle felt narrower than it was. Jalen could feel eyes behind him, not because anyone had said a word, but because silence itself has weight, the kind of silence that grows heavier when someone's in the way. He reached his assigned row, 18B, and tilted his backpack upward toward the overhead bin. It wasn't particularly large, just stuffed with everything he needed for the next 2 weeks. His hoodie, his journal, the headphones his mom bought him on layaway, and a small framed photo of the two of them at the airport, grinning like the world was theirs. But the zipper snagged on a loose strap. He tugged once. Nothing. He tugged again, and it caught even tighter. Behind him, a man in a business suit coughed. Not a polite cough, but the sharp kind meant to say, "Hurry up." A woman sighed audibly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The low hum of boarding chatter felt like it dimmed around him, as if the entire cabin had narrowed its gaze to this one awkward moment. Jalen's palms were slick. His heart started that nervous, uninvited rhythm again. He muttered softly, mostly to himself, "Just a second," and that's when she appeared. Monica. Her presence was sharp, like a light flicking on in a dark room. She didn't approach him the way other attendants did when passengers struggled. There was no soft need a hand or gentle patience. She moved like someone stepping into a problem they'd been waiting to solve. "You need to take your seat." "Now!" she snapped. Her voice was low, but firm, cold. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Jalen glanced back, startled. "I'm sorry, I just—" He gave the strap one last pull, but it wouldn't budge. Monica exhaled sharply through her nose, not loud, but pointed enough to say, "I've had enough." She stepped closer, too close, the scent of hairspray and coffee filling the air between them. Without asking, without warning, she grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him down into the seat. The impact wasn't violent. It didn't bruise. But it rang out in that cabin like the clang of a drop tray. A dull thud followed by an immediate silence that seemed to swallow the air. Jalen's head jerked slightly with emotion. The backpack dangled awkwardly from bin, half open. His hoodie bunched beneath him as he landed. His breath caught in his throat. Several passengers turned. A woman in row 17 gasped softly. The man in the suit took a careful step back, his eyebrows raised but his mouth shut. Someone whispered, "What was that?" Monica straightened her uniform, smoothed the fabric over her sleeve, and lifted her chin as if nothing had happened. Not a flicker of guilt crossed her face. Her voice came out flat, practiced, like a script she'd said 100 times. "Buckle up." Then she walked away. Just like that. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the eyes that had seen. No care for the boy left frozen in her wake. Jalen sat there, his body rigid, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. His hand gripped the armrest until his knuckles went pale. He wasn't used to being noticed like this. Not in the worst way. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He'd spent his whole life trying not to be a problem. He didn't even fully understand what he'd done wrong. All he knew was how it felt. A cold flush of humiliation that burned hotter than any physical pain could. The woman in the next seat, a soft-faced grandmother type with silver hair, leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but filled with concern. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jalen forced a small nod, but he couldn't make his throat work. His eyes stared ahead at the seat in front of him, but his mind was stuck on that moment, her hand, the shove, the sound. Humiliation doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's quiet. It crawls under your skin and settles in your chest like a cold stone. As Monica walked back down the aisle, her shoes clicking against the floor, Jalen felt it settle deeper. Not just embarrassment, but something else. Something sharper. A sense that this wasn't over. And somewhere, just a few rows up in seat 1A, someone had seen the entire thing. The plane's cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding continued. Passengers shuffled past with the clumsy rhythm of tired travelers, bumping armrests, tugging carry-ons, murmuring sorry without really meaning it. But Jalen didn't hear any of it. He sat in A-Team like he'd sunk into quicksand, the spot where Monica's hand had pushed and burned, not from pain, but from something worse, the invisible weight of being treated like less. He stared straight ahead at the seat in front of him, its vinyl fabric blurring as his throat tightened. But what he didn't know yet was that he hadn't been invisible, far up in the first row of first class. Seat 1A, a pair of eyes had followed the entire exchange from the moment Monica approached him. The man in 1A was older, mid-50s, maybe early 60s, with a presence that filled the cabin without saying a word. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like it had been made for him. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed with precision, and an unassuming pair of reading glasses sat on the tray table next to a newspaper he hadn't turned the page on for several minutes. Because from the moment he'd seen Monica's hand land on that boy's shoulder, he hadn't looked away. His name was Elliot Monroe, though only a handful of people on the plane would recognize the name. Others might just see a rich man in seat 1A. But he wasn't just rich. He wasn't just powerful. He owned the company that supplied half the catering to the airline they were flying on, and he despised seeing power misused. Elliot tilted his head slightly as Monica passed back through first class, her expression smooth and professional, the kind you'd expect to see on a glossy airline brochure, if not for the way her jaw was a little too tight or the way her shoulders stiffened when a passenger said, "Excuse me." You might have thought she was calm, but Elliot had built a life reading people. He knew the difference between a smile and a mask. His gaze flicked toward row 18 again. He saw the boy, hoodie slightly crumpled, backpack still awkwardly hanging half-zipped in the overhead. Jalen sat with his hands locked in his lap, shoulders tucked inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Something in Elliot's chest tightened. It reminded him of a time long ago when he'd been a kid in the wrong seat. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. But not yet. He didn't need to make calls. Not now. He needed to watch. Meanwhile, Jalen's seatmate, the silver-haired woman who'd whispered to him earlier, leaned closer again. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "that wasn't right." Her words came like a warm blanket in a room gone cold. Jalen blinked, as if shaking himself out of a fog. He gave a small nod, but his lips pressed together, swallowing down everything he wanted to say. "She shouldn't have done that," the woman continued, firmer now. "I've flown my whole life. I've never seen a flight attendant put hands on a passenger like that." Behind them, someone muttered, "I saw it too." Another voice agreed. A quiet murmur spread through their section like a ripple in still water. But Monica didn't notice. She was back near the galley, her clipped voice echoing faintly as she talked with another crew member. What she didn't realize was that the air around her had changed. What had been a moment of silent humiliation was now a gathering current, a shared tension, witnesses who had seen what she'd done. And sitting in 1A, Elliot Monroe leaned back in his seat with the quiet, measured patience of a man who knew exactly when to move and when to let others hang themselves with their own rope. He reached down, unfastened his briefcase, and pulled out a slim black tablet. He unlocked it with a swipe, and a camera icon glimmered in the corner, because unbeknownst to Monica, Elliot had already captured what happened. A clean, clear video. Her shove, his fall, the gasps. Elliot exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to let this disappear into the usual excuses. As the last passengers boarded, the captain's voice boomed gently through the overhead speakers, calm and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 237 to London Heathrow. We'll be departing shortly. Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The doors were closing. The cabin crew moved into their final checks. Monica walked past row 18 again, avoiding Jalen's eyes. Not because she felt guilt, but because she didn't think she needed to. She had no idea that someone with more power than she could imagine was watching from just a few feet away. And he wasn't just any passenger. He was about to make a call that would change everything. The steady rhythm of boarding, rolling suitcases, the shuffle of tired feet, the occasional thump of an overhead bin should have been ordinary. But underneath it, something invisible and heavy curled to the cabin like fog. Every sound felt louder than usual. Every movement, a little slower. Passengers didn't talk in full sentences now. They whispered, like they'd all collectively decided something had happened, even if they didn't yet know what to do about it. The intercom crackled, and the faintly cheerful safety announcement began to play. "Welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen." The familiar voice washed through the aircraft like a warm, scripted wave, but it didn't quite stick this time. No one was listening. Not really. Jalen sat stiff in his seat, shoulders rounded forward, hands clenched in his lap. His white hoodie, the one his mom had ironed that morning, the one that made him feel clean, put together, was slightly wrinkled now from Monica's shove. The moment replayed in his mind like a loop that wouldn't stop spinning. The zipper snagging, her voice, sharp as broken glass, her hand slamming against his shoulder. "Buckle up." It was supposed to be a simple flight, his first international trip. Instead, before the plane had even left the ground, The air felt poisoned. Across the aisle, the older woman who'd spoken earlier leaned forward again. Her face was soft with concern, the kind strangers show when they wish they could undo something they've seen. "Sweetheart," she whispered again, careful to keep her voice low. "Are you all right?" Jalen nodded automatically, not because he was okay, but because that's what he'd been taught all his life. Don't make a scene. Don't talk back. Don't give them a reason to say you're the problem. He forced his lips into something that almost looked like a smile, but the woman saw through it. Her fingers gently brushed the air between them, as if she wanted to place a hand on his arm, but wasn't sure she should. "What she did," she murmured. "That wasn't right." Jalen's chest burned. He wanted to say, "I know." He wanted to say, "I didn't do anything wrong." But the word sat heavy on his tongue, stuck in a place where fear lives. Monica appeared again, not from the shadows, but from the front galley, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. Her spine was so straight, it almost looked rehearsed. She walked past row 18, and even though she didn't look at Jalen, he felt her presence like a blade at his back. It wasn't guilt in her stride. It was confidence. The kind of confidence built from believing no one would ever call her out. A man 2 rows back shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between Jalen and Monica. He'd seen it too. Another woman whispered to her seatmate, shaking her head. The murmurs were quiet but contagious, like a storm cloud gathering weight in silence. But Monica, she moved on as if nothing had happened, straightening blankets, glancing at seatbelts, smoothing her uniform like everything was perfectly under control. She didn't see the eyes that followed her. She didn't see Elliot Monroe in seat 1A, fingers resting lightly on his tablet, the recorded footage glowing faintly in the reflection of his glasses. He watched it the way a lion watches prey, patient, silent, calculating. The atmosphere thickened, like air before a thunderstorm. You couldn't quite point to it, but you could feel it pressing against your chest. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed louder. Jalen stared at the tray table in front of him, fighting the sting behind his eyes. He wasn't the kind of kid who cried easily. He'd learned a long time ago that tears rarely help. But the humiliation was sharp and cold, not because of the shove, because of the way she'd walked away like he didn't matter. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his mom. "Airplane, call me when you land. I love you. Be safe, baby." He stared at the message for a long time, the lump in his throat growing. Be safe. She had no idea what had already happened. A few rows up, Elliot leaned back in his seat. One tap on his tablet, and the airline's logo popped up in a secure contact list. He didn't make the call yet, but the decision was already made. Back in row 18, a final announcement rang through the cabin. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure." And just like that, the sound returned to normal, but nothing felt normal at all. Jalen sat frozen, heart hammering. The passengers sat in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others glancing between each other in uneasy silence. And Monica, standing at the front of the cabin, adjusted her blazer and smiled the kind of smile meant for brochures. She thought it was over. She didn't realize the storm was already brewing, and the captain was about to hear something that would change everything. The engines outside began their slow, thunderous rumble, vibrating faintly through the cabin floor. It was the kind of sound that usually meant adventure was beginning, but to Jalen, it felt like a countdown. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling final preparations for a pushback. Monica stood at the front, near the galley, hands neatly folded behind her back, like a soldier at attention. Her face was a mask of calm, her eyes, though, sharp, alert, already scanning for the next inconvenience. She didn't know her biggest problem wasn't behind a seatbelt in row 18. It was in seat 1A. Elliot Monroe, quiet, composed, watching everything. The faint glow from his tablet screen reflected off his silver-framed glasses. He'd started recording the moment she shoved Jalen. Now, his finger hovered over the screen, ready to send. He wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who could move mountains with a single phone call. And Monica had no idea. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 709 to London. We'll be pushing back shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure all devices are set to airplane mode. The usual chorus of clicks followed, seatbelts locking in place, phones being switched off. But beneath the routine, something else stirred. Uneasy glances, tight shoulders, a quiet ripple of tension moving down the rows like wind over tall grass. Monica walked down the aisle for her final check, the soft click of her heels rhythmically echoing. When she passed Jalen, she didn't so much as glance his way, as if erasing him would make the moment disappear. But he saw her, and so did the woman in 18C, and the businessman in 20A, and the young couple in 17D, and E who'd whispered earlier. She was no longer invisible. She was a shadow moving through a crowd that knew. Elliot exhaled slowly, then tapped send. The video shot through an encrypted app straight to his assistant on the ground, and a second copy straight to a direct line. Within 60 seconds, a quiet ping hit the cockpit. Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with 27 years in the sky, frowned when the notification popped up on the tablet mounted beside the controls. His co-pilot gave him a questioning look. "It's marked priority," Harris muttered. He opened it. The video began to play. Monica's voice cut through the low cabin noise. "You need to take your seat now." Jalen's quiet, polite, almost frightened reply, "Sorry, just a second." And then the shove. The captain froze. His jaw tightened. He replayed it again, slower this time, eyes narrowing on Monica's hand gripping the teen's shoulder. Then the way she turned her back. Clean, calculated, unapologetic. The co-pilot leaned closer. She didn't just do that, did she? Harris didn't answer right away. He'd flown through lightning storms and engine failures, but there was something about this kind of quiet, ugly power that made his blood run cold. He pressed the intercom button. "Lead flight attendant to the cockpit, please." In the cabin, Monica stiffened. That tone, the captain's voice wasn't routine anymore. She turned sharply, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the cockpit, every step slower than the last. Passengers' eyes followed her. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they felt the shift. Jalen glanced out the window. His palms were damp. His heart thudded against his ribs. He had no idea someone up front had seen what happened. He only knew that the silence was getting heavier. Monica slipped to the cockpit door, and it clicked shut behind her. The co-pilot said nothing. He didn't have to. Harris turned to her, expression hard. "Monica, do you want to explain this?" He tapped the screen. The video played again, louder this time. Her face drained of color. That's not what it looks like," she stammered. The passenger wasn't cooperating. "He's a child," Harris snapped. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "And that," he pointed at the screen, "is assault." She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. "You understand," Harris continued. "This isn't something that can be ignored. Not in my aircraft." Monica's throat bobbed. She forced a brittle smile. "Captain, maybe we can handle this quietly." But Harris was already picking up the interphone. His voice when he spoke to ground control was clipped, professional, deadly precise. "Tower, this is Captain Harris. We need to hold departure. Immediate security request." Back in the cabin, passengers exchanged confused looks. A few heads turned toward the windows as the pushback suddenly halted. The engines fell to an idle hum. The woman in 18C leaned toward Jalen again. "Something's happening," she whispered. His stomach twisted. "Is it because of me?" Her hand gently patted his arm. "Maybe, but maybe that's not a bad thing." A flight attendant, not Monica, walked briskly down the aisle, whispering something to another crew member. The murmurs grew louder now, like a current spreading through water. The quiet storm was finally breaking. In the cockpit, Harris hung up the interphone and turned back to Monica. "You're stepping out of service." "Now." She froze. "Captain." "Now," he repeated. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. For the first time that day, Monica's perfect posture cracked. A tremor passed through her hands as she stepped out of the cockpit, pale and silent. As the door opened, passengers caught the sight of her face. and the strange, satisfied calm in Harris's eyes behind her. A minute later, the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight will experience a short delay before departure. We appreciate your patience." What he didn't say, what they all felt, was that something had changed. The silence in the cabin wasn't heavy anymore. It was electric, waiting. Jalen looked down at his hands, breathing shallow and fast. He didn't know the full picture yet. He didn't know someone had stood up for him from the front of the plane, but he felt it. Something was shifting in his favor. The captain had made a call, and nothing about this flight would ever be the same again. The engines quieted to a low purr. The hum of excitement that usually marked the beginning of a journey was gone, replaced by an electric tension that crept through the cabin like static in the air before a thunderstorm. Jalen sat motionless, his fingers curled tightly around the edges of his hoodie. His heart thudded against his ribs, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but loud enough for him to feel it in his throat. He didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he could sense it. Something in the rhythm of the flight had shifted. The flight attendants whispered near the galley. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting toward the front of the aircraft, toward Monica. She stood stiffly against the wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight. The perfect image of a flight attendant had cracked. There were lines of worry on her face now. A few passengers glanced her way, not with the casual indifference they'd had before, but with the sharp curiosity that comes when people know something's wrong. The captain's door remained shut. The silence stretched. Then the sound came. A sharp knock on the forward door. Not from inside. From the jet bridge. A murmur swept through the cabin. Heads turned like dominoes down the aisle. A child whispered to their parent, "Why aren't we flying?" Someone further back muttered, "This can't be good." The forward flight attendant walked briskly to the door, exchanged a few quiet words through the small peephole window, and unlocked it with a hiss of pressurized air. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped on board, their black boots thumping on the metal threshold. Behind them, a woman in a dark blazer followed, a customer relations manager for the airline. Her badge gleamed. Her expression didn't. Up front in seat 1A, Elliot Monroe quietly closed his tablet. He didn't need it anymore. The gears were already turning. He'd made one call. The right people had listened. The lead officer surveyed the cabin with trained calm, scanning for tension, reading faces. Passengers fell silent. Even the toddlers who had been whining moments earlier seemed to sense that this was no longer ordinary boarding. He approached Monica first. "Ma'am," the officer said evenly, "we need to have a word." Her smile was forced, brittle at the edges. "Officer, I can explain." "You can explain," he cut in gently but firmly, "off the aircraft." Her throat bobbed. The other flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, but none stepped forward to shield her. Whatever professional solidarity they shared had just fractured under the weight of truth. Passengers watched openly now. No one pretended to be reading magazines anymore. Every pair of eyes was drawn to the unfolding scene. The stewardess who had once commanded the aisle, now standing very small at the front of a plane she no longer controlled. Jalen shrank into a seat as the officers moved closer. For a second, a wave of panic rushed through him. Was this because of me? His seatmate, the kind woman in 18C, leaned close. "Hey!" she whispered softly. "This isn't your fault. Remember that." He nodded, but the words barely sank in. His mind flashed back to the shove, to Monica's cold voice, to the sound of the entire cabin going silent around him. One of the officers turned toward the rows. "Is there a passenger named Jalen?" The world seemed to narrow to a pinpoint. Dozens of heads swiveled. His breath caught. Slowly, he raised his hand. "Son, can you come with us for a moment?" the officer asked. His tone wasn't harsh. It was steady, gentle, the kind used with someone who'd just been hurt. I didn't do anything," Jalen stammered. The woman in 18C touched his arm reassuringly. "It's okay. Go on." As Jalen walked up the aisle, he felt the eyes of every passenger on his back. Whispered voices rippled behind him, not cruel this time, but filled with sympathy and outrage. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." A young woman whispered, "I saw what happened. The airline manager stepped forward, kneeling slightly to Jalen's level when he reached the front. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Karen. I'm very sorry about what happened to you. You're safe now, okay?" Her voice wasn't fake. It was steady, professional, but with a softness Jalen hadn't expected. Something in his chest loosened just a little. Behind them, Monica's composure was fraying fast. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. He was holding up the entire line. "I did what I had to do." Karen's head snapped up, her expression suddenly made of steel. "What you did," she said, each word clipped, "was lay hands on Minor, on my aircraft, with multiple witnesses. And video." The blood drained from Monica's face. The officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, please step off the plane with us." Passengers didn't cheer, but something in the air shifted. A wave of vindicated silence. Even those who hadn't seen the shove now understood that something serious had happened. The officers escorted Monica down the aisle. The whispering grew louder. Phones lifted discreetly. A couple of passengers recorded the moment she disappeared through the door and onto the jet bridge. For the first time since boarding, Jalen felt air rush into his lungs like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. Karen guided him gently back to his seat. "You did nothing wrong, Jalen. We're taking this very seriously. Captain Harris wanted me to personally tell you that." His voice was small. "Am I in trouble?" She crouched a little, meeting his gaze. "No, sweetheart. She is." She gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before standing and heading back up front. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Harris got the confirmation through his headset. "Ground security has removed the flight attendant. Situation contained." "Good," he replied. "Let's get this boy home safely." He turned to his co-pilot. "I've been flying for 27 years. You don't let something like that slide. Not on my plane." Back in the cabin, Elliot watched quietly from 1A. He wasn't one for applause or theatrics. But when his eyes met Jalen's from across the rows, he gave the boy a small nod. Jalen didn't fully understand who the man was or how much he'd done, but he felt it, the way someone can feel when they're not alone anymore. As the doors shut and the aircraft prepared for takeoff once more, the captain's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've resolved the safety matter. We'll be departing shortly." The applause wasn't loud at first, just a soft clap from somewhere near row 15. Then another, and another. Soon, the cabin filled with it, a quiet, powerful rhythm. Not for the flight, not for the airline, for the boy who was brave enough to simply exist when someone tried to silence him. Jalen leaned back against the seat. This time, the engine's rumble didn't sound like a countdown. It sounded like freedom. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines roared to life. Outside, the sun was painting streaks of gold across the tarmac, but inside the plane, something warmer was unfolding. Something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with truth finally being seen. Jalen sat in silence, feeling the vibration of the aircraft under his sneakers. Just minutes earlier, it had felt like the entire world was closing in on him. But now it was different. The air felt clearer, lighter. The woman in 18C leaned toward him again, her voice soft. "You did good, sweetheart. You didn't deserve that." Jalen's throat tightened. He gave a small nod, trying to hold his composure. He wasn't used to strangers standing up for him. Back home in Atlanta, he'd learned early on that the safest way to get through uncomfortable moments was to shrink, stay quiet, and wait for it to pass. But this time, the world hadn't just looked away. This time, it stood up in the first-class cabin. Elliot Monroe sat quietly with his arms crossed. He was a man used to solving problems quietly, not seeking credit. His tailored suit and calm demeanor didn't scream power, but for those who knew the name meant something. Jalen didn't know yet that Elliot was one of the most influential figures in commercial aviation, a senior federal transportation advisor, and the head of a passenger rights coalition. He'd been in countless hearings and meetings where stories like Jalen's were statistics, numbers on paper. But today, it wasn't numbers. It was a boy, a real face, a real pain, and he wasn't about to let it be ignored. The The plane lifted off with a smooth climb. A soft cheer rose from somewhere in the cabin, the kind people give when a tense moment finally breaks. Jalen watched the city lights fade beneath him, his reflection faint in the window. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's calm voice over the pay. "We'd like to thank you for your patience. We are now climbing to our cruising altitude. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." But there was a subtle note in his tone, steady, protective, like a man who'd made a promise to someone on board. Monica's absence was a weight lifted from the cabin. The remaining flight attendants moved gently now, voices soft, their smiles genuine. A small kindness seemed to flow in every interaction, a quiet acknowledgement of the storm that had just passed. A flight attendant approached Jalen's row. She wasn't part of Monica's earlier interactions. Her name tag read Elena. "Hey there," she said softly, kneeling slightly beside his seat. "Would you like some hot chocolate or maybe a snack? Captain asked me to make sure you're comfortable." Jalen blinked, surprised. "Hot chocolate?" She smiled. "With marshmallows." He nodded, and for the first time since boarding, his shoulders loosened. Meanwhile, in 1A, Elliot took out his phone. He wasn't just making calls. He was making things move. A quiet message to the Department of Transportation, another to the airline's legal liaison, and one more to someone higher, someone who made real decisions. Within minutes, a chain reaction had begun outside that aircraft. Monica's name had already landed in the inbox of corporate investigators. Statements from passengers were being requested before they even touched down. Justice wasn't waiting for tomorrow. It had already started. Elena returned with a hot chocolate, placing it gently in Jalen's hands. It smelled like home, warm and sweet. The simple kindness nearly undid him. The woman in 18C gave him a proud smile. "You see? People are paying attention now." But Jalen wasn't sure why. Why would anyone care about some shy teen flying alone for the first time? He wasn't special. Just a kid trying not to get in the way. That's when a voice came from just ahead. "Hey, Jalen?" He looked up. It was Elliot Monroe. The man from 1A was now standing in the aisle, leaning on the seat in front of Jalen's. His presence had a quiet weight to it, not intimidating, but solid. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" Elliot asked. Jalen shrugged nervously. Sure." Elliot lowered himself into the aisle seat across from him, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. "You handled yourself well back there," Elliot said. Jalen shook his head. "I didn't do anything." "That's exactly it," Elliot replied. "You didn't have to. What happened to you wasn't your fault." The boy's eyes lowered. "People don't usually stand up for me." Elliot's voice softened. "They should, and more importantly, they will." Jalen frowned, confused. "Why?" Elliot leaned in slightly. "Because I'm going to make sure what happened today isn't forgotten." A silence hung in the air, not awkward, but heavy with meaning. Jalen didn't yet realize that the man sitting across from him was about to turn his moment of pain into a turning point for thousands. Elliot continued. "I've seen a lot of cases like this. Too many, but rarely with this many witnesses. Rarely this clear. And you know what's different this time?" "What?" Jalen asked softly. "I was here." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Elliot wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact and making a promise. The woman in 18C leaned closer, her voice firm now. "Honey, I've already given my statement to the attendants. What that woman did was unacceptable. You didn't deserve that." Elliot nodded at her. "Thank you, ma'am. Every voice counts." Another passenger raised a hand from across the aisle. "I filmed part of it, if you need the footage." The cabin slowly began to shift into something extraordinary. What started as scattered whispers had grown into a collective stand. Passenger after passenger spoke up, a ripple of solidarity that made Jalen's chest ache in a way he couldn't name. He wasn't invisible anymore. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, Elliot made a few quiet calls from the galley, careful not to disturb anyone. The passengers went back to their books, movies, or quiet conversations, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just a plane full of strangers. It was a plane that had witnessed something and chosen to stand together. Jalen sipped his hot chocolate, staring out the window at the endless stretch of sky. For the first time since boarding, the view didn't feel so far away. It felt like hope. An hour later, Captain Harris stepped out of the cockpit and made his way down the aisle. He stopped right by Jalen's seat. "Hey, young man," he said kindly. "I just wanted to tell you, what happened to you was not okay. Not on my flight. Not on any flight." Jalen blinked, surprised. "You know my name?" The captain chuckled softly. "Of course I do. When something happens on my plane, I make it my business to know who needs protecting." He rested a hand on the seat in front of him. "When we land, some people from the airline and the authorities will talk to you. You'll be supported the whole way, and you'll have a lot more people on your side than you think." Passengers nearby murmured their agreement. For the first time, Jalen believed it. As the captain walked away, Elliot returned his seat and gazed out at the night sky. He'd seen many injustices get buried under procedures and legal jargon, but this one was different. This one had a face, a young face, a face the world was about to hear. And in that moment, somewhere between two continents, something shifted for Jalen too. The boy who had once tried to disappear into background was now the quiet center of a story no one could ignore. When the flight finally descended, the seatbelt signs pinged on. But the hum in the cabin wasn't ordinary. It was anticipation. Outside the gate, press representatives and legal teams were already waiting, because someone in 1A had made sure the world knew what happened up there. As the wheels touched down, Jalen felt the plane shudder. Not with fear this time, but with power. The kind that comes when silence breaks. The kind that doesn't fade after landing. For a moment, everything stood still. The air inside the cabin felt charged, like the second before a thunderstorm finally breaks open. The captain's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Escort her off this aircraft," he said, steady and clear. No hesitation. No negotiation. The gate supervisor blinked, stunned, as if she hadn't expected this to go that far. Monica's head jerked toward the captain, her eyes wide. "What? Captain, I was just—" "This is not a debate," he interrupted, his voice low but commanding. "We're responsible for every life on this plane. If you can't treat passengers with basic dignity, you don't fly with my crew." The words landed heavy, not just on Monica, but on everyone. There was power in the way he said it, the kind that made people sit up a little straighter. A sharp, audible gasp rippled through the cabin, like wind through dry leaves. A few rows back, someone whispered, "He's serious." Another voice added softly. Finally, Monica's face flushed a furious red, her lips trembling as she tried to compose herself. The immaculate uniform that once gave her authority now looked small on her, just fabric, not power. "You can't just—" She tried again, but the gate supervisor stepped closer. "Ma'am, please come with me." The cabin seemed to exhale as she realized there was no way out of this. Her posture, one so sharp and controlled, wilted under the captain's unwavering gaze. Passengers began clapping, first softly, like a spark catching, then louder, stronger. It wasn't wild applause. It was something purer, a release, a way of saying what words couldn't. Jalen sat frozen, his eyes wide, as the sound surrounded him. Not long ago, he'd felt invisible. Now the whole cabin saw. A woman in the row ahead gave him a reassuring nod. The kind woman across the aisle reached over and lightly squeezed his hand. Monica's eyes flickered to him as she was escorted toward the door. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The jet bridge door opened with a sharp click. Monica stepped out. Gone. The captain watched her leave, then turned back to the passengers. His voice softened, but it carried strength. "We don't tolerate disrespect. Not on my flight. Not ever." And just like that, the cabin, once filled with fear and silence, filled with something entirely different. Trust, hope, and the quiet, unshakable truth that one act of courage can change everything. The captain's voice returned to the intercom, not rushed, not emotional, controlled. It was the kind of voice that quiets a room without raising its volume. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this flight will be delayed a few minutes as we assign a replacement crew member. But I want to be very clear about something." A slight pause followed. Even the babies who'd been fussing earlier seemed to quiet down, as if the plane itself was listening. Every passenger on this flight deserves respect. No exceptions. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The kind of silence that meant something. Then it started softly. A clap from row 5. Another from row 12. Within seconds, the cabin filled with applause that rolled like a wave from the back of the plane to the front. Jalen sat there, stunned. All his life, he'd learned to stay quiet, to not cause waves. But here, at 1A, sat a man who didn't know him, who could have easily ignored everything and didn't. Monica, still standing stiff near the forward galley, looked pale, her polished, professional armor cracked under the weight of 100 eyes on her. The captain stepped out of the cockpit for a brief moment, just long enough for the passengers to see him, not just hear his voice. He had salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes, and a quiet authority that didn't need a badge to be believed. He didn't look at Monica. He looked at the cabin, at the people. Jalen shifted in his seat, trying to process it all. For so long, power had felt like something far away, something other people had. But right now, for the first time, someone had used their power for him. A lesson had just been taught at 1A, and everyone had heard it. The replacement flight attendant boarded 25 minutes later. The tension that had wrapped around the cabin earlier had loosened, replaced by a quiet kind of solidarity. Passengers made small talk with strangers, something rare on flights like these. The engines rumbled to life. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside the window, runway lights lined up like a path through the night. Jalen stared at his reflection in the glass. He wasn't imagining this. This really happened. The woman across the aisle leaned closer with a soft, reassuring smile. "Good for you, sweetheart," she whispered. The man behind him added, almost under his breath, "About time someone said something." The plane rolled forward slowly, taxiing toward the runway. Jalen didn't respond. He just breathed, really breathed. For the first time since Monica's hand shoved him into that seat, the moment wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It had become about courage, not his, but someone else's on his behalf. And that was just as powerful. When the nose of the plane tilted upward and the engines roared, Jalen felt the weight on his chest begin to lift too. This wasn't just takeoff. This was freedom in motion. 30 minutes into the flight, the fastened seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding. The cabin was bathed in the warm glow of overhead lights, and soft chatter filled the air. Then the captain's voice came again, steady, thoughtful, like a father addressing his family. "I hope everyone is comfortable," he began. "I want to remind each of you, if you ever see something wrong, say something. Silence protects the wrong people. Doing what's right doesn't always make headlines, but sometimes it makes history." A hush fell over the cabin. His words weren't scripted like a safety announcement. They were personal, honest. It was the kind of message people didn't forget. An elderly man in row 9 nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting years to hear someone say that. A flight attendant near the galley shifted uncomfortably, not from guilt, but because the message landed deeply. Jalen leaned back in his seat, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't used to being defended, let alone become the reason someone spoke truth into a microphone. He didn't want to cry, but the feeling was overwhelming. A mixture of relief, validation, and quiet strength. For the first time that day, he wasn't invisible. Hours passed. The aircraft began its descent. The lights of the destination city sparkled below like scattered diamonds, a sharp contrast to the storm Jalen had felt in his chest just a few hours earlier. The familiar jolt of wheels touching the runway came, and a soft cheer rose from a few passengers, a tradition on many flights, but tonight it carried a different energy. People weren't just relieved they'd landed. They were proud of what happened on this plane. As passengers stood to retrieve their bags, they moved slower than usual. They didn't rush past Jalen. They paused. A woman touched his shoulder gently. "You mattered tonight." A man in a business suit nodded firmly. "That captain's a good one. So are you." Even a flight attendant, not Monica, but the replacement, knelt slightly beside his seat and said softly, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You didn't deserve it." Jalen's throat tightened. He had no idea how to respond. So he just nodded. But in that nod lived 100 unspoken emotions. At the exit, the captain stood tall in his uniform, greeting passengers with calm authority. When Jalen reached him, their eyes met. "You handled yourself with a lot of grace today," the captain said. Jalen swallowed hard. "Thank you for standing up for me." The captain's smile was quiet but powerful. "No, thank you for reminding this plane who we're here to serve. What happened on Flight 237 never made the news. No journalists wrote about it. No cameras were there. But it lived. It lived in the whispers of passengers telling their friends, 'You won't believe what happened on my flight.' It lived in the quiet pride of a boy who walked out taller than he walked in. It lived in the crew lounge, where other flight attendants heard the story and thought twice before treating someone like less. Power isn't about uniforms. It isn't about titles. Power belongs to those who use it to protect. And somewhere in the sky, a captain flew on with an unspoken vow. Not on my watch. Sometimes, justice doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes, it happens at 30,000 feet, when one person decides to do the right thing. If you've ever experienced injustice and stayed silent because no one stood up, this one's for you. Speak up. Be the witness. Be the voice.